They say history is written by the victors. But what happens when the victors spend 150 years trying to burn every page? What happens when a man's name is deliberately scratched from census records? When his existence is denied in official documents? When even mentioning him becomes illegal in 3 southern states? What happens when the most dangerous weapon ever used against American slavery wasn't a gun, wasn't a rebellion, wasn't even an underground railroad, but a memory technique taught by one African man that slaveholders feared more than any army? This is the story they tried to erase. The story of Jabari Mansa. And after you hear it, you'll understand exactly why they were so terrified. The year is 1807. A slave ship called the Henrietta cuts through Atlantic waters, its hold packed with 312 stolen lives. Among them, a 23-year-old man named Jabari Mansa, grandson of a Wolof griot, a traditional West African historian and storyteller, whose entire existence was dedicated to preserving knowledge through oral tradition. Jabari had been trained since childhood in the ancient memory palace technique, a method allowing him to store vast quantities of information in his mind with perfect recall. Names, genealogies, stories, songs, treaties, the entire history of his people, encoded in the architecture of his consciousness. But on that ship, chained in darkness for 67 days, something unprecedented happened. An older man named Boubacar, himself a griot from the Mandinka people, recognized Jabari's training. And in whispered conversations conducted in the few moments when the crew wasn't listening, Boubacar gave Jabari a mission that would change American history. They will take our bodies. They will take our names. They will take our children. But they cannot take what we remember unless we let them. You must teach them to remember. That is how we survive. That is how we resist. When Jabari arrived at a tobacco plantation in Virginia, he was given the name Jacob. The overseer noted he was intelligent but sullen, requires watching. What they didn't know was that Jacob was watching them. Every face, every name, every route, every conversation, building in his mind a perfect map of the plantation, its people, its vulnerabilities. And more importantly, he was watching the other enslaved people, identifying those he could teach. Within 6 months, Jabari had secretly trained 11 people in basic memory techniques. Not the full griot system, that would take years, but enough. Enough to remember their African names, enough to remember their family lineages, enough to remember the stories of who they were before the ships, because that's what slavery required to function, forgetting. Forgetting you were human, forgetting you had a history, forgetting you were anything more than property. Jabari was teaching people to remember they were people. By 1810, he'd been sold twice more, once for inciting unrest, once for mysterious influence over other slaves. Each plantation became a new classroom. Each sale spread his teaching further. On the Morrison plantation in South Carolina, he trained 23 people. On the Caldwell estate in Georgia, 31. He taught them to memorize maps of the Underground Railroad routes they'd never seen. He taught them to remember the exact legal language of their bills of sale so they could identify forgeries. He taught them to preserve African languages by encoding vocabulary into work songs that sounded like mindless field hollers to white ears, but were actually Wolof and Mandinka language lessons. But most dangerously, he taught them to remember everything their enslavers said and did, every crime, every cruelty, every whispered conversation about debts and affairs and business dealings that white men assumed their property was too stupid to understand or remember. The psychological effect on slaveholders was immediate and devastating. By 1815, plantation owners across 3 states were reporting the same disturbing phenomenon. Their slaves were acting differently. Not rebellious in the traditional sense. There were no uprisings, no violence, no escape attempts. Instead, something far more unnerving. Enslaved people were making eye contact, responding to orders with an unsettling precision that suggested they understood far more than they should, singing songs in languages that sounded African. Worst of all, they seemed to be remembering things, events from years ago, conversations overheard, promises broken. The Harding brothers, plantation owners in Alabama, both suffered complete psychological breakdowns in 1818 after their enslaved workers began quietly, without hostility, reciting back to them, verbatim, conversations the brothers had years earlier about falsifying estate documents to cheat their sister out of her inheritance. The slaves said nothing threatening. They simply repeated the words back with perfect accuracy at strategic moments. Both brothers were institutionalized within 6 months. Edmund Hale, one of South Carolina's wealthiest planters, experienced something similar in 1822. During a dinner party, one of his house slaves, a woman named Sarah who'd learned Jabari's techniques, quietly corrected a guest's misquote of scripture. Then, when asked how she knew the Bible, she recited the entirety of the Gospel of Luke, word perfect, in English, then in Greek, then explained, in flawless diction, the historical context of its authorship. Hale was so shaken by the demonstration of intellectual capacity he'd convinced himself was impossible for black people that he freed his entire household staff within a month and became by 1825 one of the South's most vocal abolitionists. His published reason? I have seen proof that we have enslaved beings whose minds equal or surpass our own. This is not a labor system. It is a holocaust of genius. But Jabari's most sophisticated technique was what he called living documents. He trained people to become human repositories of legal and financial information, to memorize property deeds, contracts, loan agreements, promissory notes. By 1830, there were at least 200 enslaved people across the South who had memorized complete legal documents that could expose fraud, illegal slave trading, contract violations, even murders. In 1834, a Virginia court case collapsed when an enslaved man named Samuel testified, despite being legally prohibited from testifying against whites, by simply stating, in front of a judge, "I can recite the contents of the destroyed will." The judge, curious, allowed it. Samuel proceeded to recite, word for word, a 23-page will that had been lost in a fire, a will that disinherited the plaintiff and exposed him as having committed arson to destroy evidence. The judge was forced to rule based on the testimony, setting a legal precedent that terrified slaveholders. Their slaves had been recording everything. By 1840, Jabari himself had become a ghost. No one knew where he was. He'd been sold so many times, moved so often, that tracking him became impossible. Some said he'd escaped. Others claimed he'd died. But his students kept teaching. The movement had become self-sustaining, a resistance movement built not on violence, but on the simple, revolutionary act of remembering. Then came 1845. A meeting of plantation owners in Charleston produced a document titled The Memory Problem, Recommendations for Legislative Action. The document, which remained classified until its discovery in 1993, explicitly outlined the threat. A system of mental training has spread among the slave population, origin unknown, which enables affected individuals to retain information with disturbing accuracy. This threatens the foundational assumption of necessary black intellectual inferiority and provides slaves with dangerous knowledge of legal and financial matters. Immediate legislative action required. What followed was a coordinated campaign of cultural erasure unprecedented in American history. South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama passed laws making it illegal to teach enslaved people memory techniques, punishable by 20 lashes for the slave and a $500 fine for any white person involved. Preachers were instructed to emphasize biblical passages about forgetting the past. Work songs were banned on many plantations. Most critically, a systematic effort began to identify and separate anyone suspected of Jabari's training, scattering communities that had preserved knowledge for decades. But here's what they didn't understand. You can't unteach memory. You can separate people, but they carry their knowledge with them. Every person Jabari trained others. Every plantation they were sold to became a new school. In 1852, a man matching Jabari's description, now in his 60s, was reportedly seen in Texas, still teaching. In 1857, in Mississippi, in 1861, in Louisiana, always moving, always teaching. By the time the Civil War began, there were an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 formerly enslaved and enslaved people across the South who had been directly or indirectly trained in his techniques. and they became the Union's most valuable intelligence asset. These men and women could report, with perfect accuracy, troop movements they'd seen months ago, supply routes, officer names, strategic conversations overheard in plantation houses. Harriet Tubman herself reportedly worked with several of Jabari's students, relying on their memorized maps and their ability to remember safe houses they'd only heard described. But then came the most disturbing part of this story. What happened after the war ended? You'd think Jabari's story would be celebrated, the man who'd created a non-violent resistance movement, the man who'd proved black intellectual equality, the man whose methods helped win the war. Instead, between 1865 and 1880, his name was systematically removed from historical records. Census. Documents that mentioned him were destroyed. Slave sale records were lost in fires. Interviews with his known students were excluded from Reconstruction-era historical projects. Why? Because his story was dangerous to everyone. To Southern whites, it proved that slavery had been a system of intellectual oppression, not natural racial hierarchy. To Northern whites, it proved that black people didn't need white saviors. They'd been saving themselves all along. To the compromised politics of Reconstruction, the story was inflammatory, a reminder of a sophisticated resistance movement that made everyone uncomfortable. By 1890, Jabari Mansa had been erased from American history. His name appeared in no textbooks, no monuments, no records. It was as if he'd never existed. But here's the thing about teaching people to remember: they remember. Jabari's story survived exactly the way he'd taught people to survive, through oral tradition, through families passing down stories, through church communities preserving testimonies, through the very memory techniques he'd taught, encoded in songs and stories that sounded like folklore but were actually precise historical records. In 1976, a graduate student named Michael Williams was researching his family history when his grandmother told him about the memory teacher her grandmother had spoken of. Following that thread, Williams found 3 other families with similar stories, then 12, then 47. By 1985, he documented a consistent oral tradition across 200+ families, all describing the same man, the same techniques, the same historical period. In 1993, a fire at a Birmingham courthouse revealed documents hidden in a bricked-up wall, including the 1845 Memory Problem Legislative Report. Suddenly, the oral histories had documentary confirmation. In 2003, researchers found Jabari's actual name in a ship manifest, encoded in a margin note by a crew member who'd recorded the African names of notable captives. Piece by piece, the story they'd tried to erase came back, not because it was written down. They destroyed those records. But because Jabari had taught people how to remember, and they had remembered. For 150 years, they had remembered him. The last confirmed mention of Jabari himself dates to 1868, a brief notice in a freedman's newspaper mentioning an elderly teacher of memory, much respected, who has founded a school in Tennessee. He would have been 84. After that, nothing. He disappears from history as quietly as he'd moved through it. But his legacy didn't disappear. Those memory techniques are still taught today in some African American communities, passed down as family traditions. The memory palace method he adapted from his griot training is now recognized as one of the most effective learning tools in cognitive science. And his fundamental lesson survived, that the most powerful weapon against oppression is not violence, but remembering. Remembering who you are. Remembering what was done. Remembering what they want you to forget. They tried to erase Jabari Mansa from history because his existence proved something the American narrative couldn't accept. That enslaved people weren't victims waiting to be saved. They were sophisticated resistors using the most advanced cognitive techniques of their time. That slavery didn't persist because black people accepted it, but because it required constant, massive, violent enforcement against people who never stopped fighting. That history isn't what's written down, it's what people refuse to forget. And now you know why. For 150 years, there were people who wanted you to forget his name. Because once you remember what one man with nothing but his mind accomplished, You start wondering what else they've made us forget. You start wondering whose other stories have been erased. You start wondering what else we're supposed to forget. Jabari Mansa taught people to remember, and maybe, after 200 years, we're finally ready to remember him.